I still remember the exact second my life tilted. Before anyone raised their voice, before a single word was spoken. It was the moment I realized everyone in that lobby was dressed for a future that no longer included me. Have you ever felt that quiet before a storm, when your instincts whisper that something irreversible is about to happen? My name is Daniel Brooks, and for 18 years, Northbridge Systems had been my second home. I knew the rhythm of the building the way sailors know tides, the polished marble floors, the low hum of servers behind sealed doors, the way executives laughed a little too loudly when investors were nearby. That morning, everything felt sharper, brighter, like the world had been turned up a notch because history was about to be made. A $2.9 billion deal. That number echoed in my head as I walked through the revolving doors. $2.9 billion. It wasn't just a contract, it was validation, proof that the sleepless nights, the missed birthdays, the quiet sacrifices no one applauded had all meant something. Investors from Falcon Ridge Group were already there. Lawyers murmured in tight circles. Assistants checked watches. Time was moving, fast. I adjusted my jacket as I crossed the lobby. No tie. I'd made that decision deliberately. Our clients had flown in overnight, eyes bloodshot, patience thin. They cared about outcomes, not rituals, results over rituals. For 18 years, my judgment had never failed this company, not once. I told myself that as I stepped toward the conference wing. That's when I saw him. Ethan Collins stood near the glass doors, arms crossed, posture stiff in that way people adopt when they want to look important. He was new, fresh title, operations director, the CEO's son. He hadn't earned the confidence he wore, but he wore it anyway, like a tailored suit borrowed from someone else's closet. He looked me up and down, slowly, deliberately. His eyes paused at my collar. "Where's your tie?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it landed heavy. Conversations nearby softened. People listened without turning their heads. I smiled, the kind of smile you give when you think professionalism will solve everything. "Our clients flew 12 hours, I said calmly. They're here to sign, not judge neckwear." For a moment, I thought reason had won. Then Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced around, sensing an audience. Power does strange things to people when they realize others are watching. "You're violating company standards," he said, louder this time. I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to disbelief. 18 years, countless deals, and this was the hill he chose to stand on? "Ethan," I said quietly, "this deal names me as lead negotiator. Let's not—" He cut me off. "Daniel Brooks," he announced, crisp, rehearsed. "You're terminated, effective immediately." Silence crashed down like a dropped glass. I remember the faces, some shocked, some embarrassed, some carefully blank. Not a single executive spoke up, not one. People I had trained, people I had protected, people whose bonuses depended on the paper waiting inside that room. 18 years ended in seconds. Security appeared, awkward and apologetic. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. Inside, my thoughts raced, but my face stayed still, calm, controlled. I handed over my badge, felt its weight leave my palm. As I walked back through the lobby, time stretched. Every step echoed. Here's what no one tells you about moments like that. They don't feel dramatic. They feel hollow, like the sound gets sucked out of the room and you're left alone with your thoughts. Outside, the air was cold. I stood on the steps watching through the glass as Falcon Ridge's representatives were ushered toward the conference room. I knew their faces, knew their concerns, knew the clause buried deep in the contract, one I had insisted on years ago to protect the company, the key person clause. If I wasn't there at closing, the deal could be withdrawn. No penalty, clean exit. I wondered if anyone inside remembered that, or if they were too busy pretending nothing had gone wrong. My phone buzzed, a message from one of the Falcon Ridge partners. Just 3 words. "Are you okay?" Time was ticking now, and for the first time that day, beneath the shock, beneath the sting of betrayal, I felt something unexpected begin to rise. Clarity. If you were in my shoes, fired publicly, discarded over something meaningless, would you rush back inside to fix their mistake? Or would you finally let them face the consequences of their silence? I stared at the glass doors, knowing that what happened next would change everything. I didn't know it yet, but the next phone call would decide the fate of a $2.9 billion empire, and whether my loyalty would cost me everything or give me back my power. Sometimes the real story begins at the exact moment everyone else thinks it's already over. I was still standing on those steps, staring through the glass at a world I had helped build, now moving forward as if I had never existed. The question wasn't whether I was hurt. The question was what I was going to do next. My phone was still in my hand. The Falcon Ridge Partners message glowed on the screen. "Are you okay?" I knew what sat beneath those words. He wasn't asking about my emotions. He was asking about the deal, about whether the foundation they were about to sign on was still solid. I didn't reply right away. Silence, I've learned, is sometimes the strongest move. 18 years began replaying in my mind like a slow, deliberate film. My first day at Northbridge, a modest office, limited resources, big promises. I had woven my life into that company's framework, every system, every process, every client relationship. Somewhere inside it all were my fingerprints. And now, all of it erased over a missing tie? It wasn't just disrespect, it was absurdity. Through the glass, I spotted Ethan Collins again. He was speaking animatedly near the conference room, hands moving, face locked in that manufactured confidence people wear when they believe authority alone makes them right. He had no idea the ground beneath him was already shifting. Power has a way of blinding those who inherit it instead of earning it. I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked toward my car. With every step, my thoughts sharpened. I didn't need to look at a watch. I could feel time pressing forward. Inside, questions were already forming. Where's Daniel? Why hasn't he joined the signing? And then there was the clause, the one I had insisted on years ago, the one people had called excessive. Key person continuity, I had argued. Today, that clause was no longer a precaution. It was a loaded truth. I sat in the driver's seat, hands resting on the steering wheel, engines still off. I asked myself a simple question. If I walked back inside right now and fixed their mistake, what would really change tomorrow? Would the silence be any different next time? Or would I simply be waiting for another moment when loyalty was convenient to forget? This wasn't anger, it was calculation. My phone vibrated again, an incoming call, Falcon Ridge's senior legal advisor. I looked at the screen and paused. Before answering, I reminded myself, control over emotion is control over outcome. "Daniel Brooks," I said evenly. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then, carefully chosen words, "We've been informed that you're no longer with Northbridge." "Not at the moment," I replied. "You understand what that could mean for today," he said. "I do," I answered, "and so do you." He didn't push further. In legal conversations, fewer words often carry the most weight. When the call ended, I started the car, but I didn't drive home. Instead, I headed to a quiet cafe across town, the same one where I'd first met Falcon Ridge months earlier. I took a seat by the window. The coffee cooled untouched, but my thoughts moved fast. I pulled out a notepad and began writing. This wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense, no shouting, no threats. It was something cleaner, a return on my terms, with authority, with boundaries. Back at Northbridge, things were unraveling. I learned later that the questions had turned sharp. The legal team had reopened the contract. Faces had drained of color. Someone had finally asked Ethan the question that mattered. Did you actually fire him? By then, the mistake was clear. But clarity doesn't reverse consequences. My phone lit up again, a new number, one of the board members. I let it ring. A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. The game had started, but I wasn't rushing. Panic makes people predictable. Silence makes them honest. I didn't answer. If you were in my position, when the same people who stayed quiet during your dismissal suddenly needed you to save them, would you respond immediately? Or would you let them sit with the weight of their choice just a little longer? The clock on the cafe wall ticked forward. Somewhere across the city, pens hovered over paper waiting, and I knew that whatever happened next wouldn't just decide the fate of a deal, it would decide who held the power now. There's a strange calm that comes after the first shock wears off. Not peace, clarity. That's what settled in as I sat by the cafe window, watching strangers pass by, unaware that a multi-billion-dollar deal was quietly bleeding out a few miles away. Have you ever noticed how the world keeps moving even when your own life feels suspended? My phone stayed face down on the table. I didn't need to look to know what was happening on the other end. Confusion, urgent whispers, lawyers flipping pages too fast. Someone realizing, far too late, that the company's most important safeguard had just been escorted out of the building by security. I took a slow sip of coffee. Bitter, cold, fitting. For years, I had been the buffer between chaos and control at Northbridge. When clients panicked, they called me. When systems failed, I stayed late. When executives wanted results without accountability, I made it work anyway. That role teaches you something valuable. You learn how people behave when pressure climbs. And right now, pressure was climbing fast. Another vibration. This time, a voicemail notification. I let it sit. Instead, my thoughts drifted backward, to the meeting years ago when the key person clause was debated. I remembered sitting in that same calm posture, explaining why continuity mattered. Deals aren't just numbers, I'd said. They're trust structures. Some executives nodded. Others looked bored. Ethan wasn't even in the room back then. He was still a name on a family tree, not a title on a door. And yet, here we were. I finally flipped the phone over. 3 missed calls now. 2 board members, 1 from HR. The irony almost made me laugh. HR had been silent when I was fired publicly, but now they wanted to talk. Funny how procedure matters only when power is threatened. I chose one call to return. Not the board, not HR. I called someone else. Mark Ellison, former COO, retired early. The kind of man who understood leverage because he'd lost it once and never forgot the feeling. He answered on the second ring. "Daniel," he said. No surprise in his voice, just recognition. "I was fired," I said. A pause, then a slow exhale. I heard. "I didn't call for sympathy," I continued. "I called to ask you one question." "Go on." "If the board comes back asking me to return, what would you do?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was firm. "I wouldn't return as an employee." That confirmed what I already knew. Inside Northbridge, the narrative was shifting. The story they were telling investors had cracks now. The press release scheduled for that afternoon was suddenly dangerous. A deal announcement without the man named in the contract, that wasn't confidence, that was negligence. My phone rang again. This time, I answered. "Daniel," a board member said, voice tight, "we need to talk." "I'm listening." There it was, the shift in tone. No authority, no distance, just need. He spoke about optics, about urgency, about how quickly things had escalated. He didn't apologize. Not yet. That came later once he realized explanations weren't enough. "I was terminated," I said, finally, publicly, over a tie. Silence. "That decision," I continued, "created a legal reality, one you're now facing." He swallowed audibly. "What would it take for you to come back?" There it was, the question they never expected to ask. "I'm not coming back," I said calmly. "At least, not the way I left." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll send terms," I added. "If you want this deal and any future stability, you'll review them carefully." When the call ended, my hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected anger, satisfaction, something louder. Instead, I felt grounded, like I had finally stepped out of a role that demanded sacrifice without respect. Outside, clouds rolled in, dimming the afternoon light.
Somewhere in a conference room, people were checking their watches, realizing time wasn't on their side anymore. I packed up my things and stood. As I walked toward the door, my phone buzzed once more. A message from Ethan Collins. Short, defensive, careless. "We need to clear this up." I stared at the screen for a moment before locking it and slipping the phone into my pocket. He still thought this was a conversation between equals. It wasn't. If power had taught me anything over 18 years, it was this. Those who mistake authority for control always reveal themselves when silence stops working. And Ethan was about to learn exactly how expensive that mistake could be.
The first sign that my absence was being felt didn't come from the board or the lawyers. It came from the market. I saw it on a muted television mounted above the cafe counter. Northbridge Systems stock ticker slid slowly across the screen, the green turning cautious, then pale. Nothing dramatic yet, just enough movement to make analysts uncomfortable, just enough to signal uncertainty. Markets react to confidence before they react to facts, and right now confidence was leaking. I stepped outside. The air had changed, heavier, stormy in that quiet way that makes you aware of time. I walked a few blocks, letting the city noise ground me. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. I wasn't avoiding responsibility. I was letting consequences mature. Back inside Northbridge, I imagined the scene with painful clarity. Lawyers hunched over contracts, assistants whispering, executives pacing, trying to look decisive while feeling exposed, and Ethan still believing this was a problem he could manage with authority and volume. Authority doesn't close gaps, judgment does. I finally checked my phone. 7 missed calls, emails stacked like warnings. One subject line stood out. Urgent, Falcon Ridge status. I opened it. Falcon Ridge hadn't pulled out yet, but they'd paused. Due diligence review extended, signature pending clarification of key person continuity, corporate language for "we're watching you bleed." That pause was enough. Investors hate uncertainty more than bad news. By mid-afternoon, financial media had picked up the story. Not the firing, not the tie, just whispers, unexpected delay, internal leadership disruption. That's how damage really begins, quietly. I returned one call, the board chair this time. "Daniel," he said, no greeting, "we're running out of time. I warned you years ago, continuity matters. We're prepared to make this right." I leaned against a concrete wall, eyes closed. "I already did," I said. "You showed me exactly where experience ranks against entitlement." He didn't argue. "We need you," he said finally. "No," I corrected him. "You need stability, and that's not the same thing." I laid out the framework. Not numbers yet. Structure, authority, clear lines of decision-making that couldn't be overridden by last names, independent reporting, a role that answered to the board, not to family. Silence on the other end, then a quiet, careful response. "We'll review." "You'll decide," I said, "soon." When the call ended, my phone buzzed immediately. Ethan again. This time, longer. "Look, this got blown out of proportion. We can fix this if you just come back in and talk." I didn't reply, because he still didn't understand. This wasn't about fixing embarrassment. It was about accountability. By evening, the effects were visible. Northbridge's stock dipped further. Not a crash, a bruise. Enough for shareholders to ask questions, enough for the board to feel heat. I drove home as the sun sank behind the skyline. The city lights flickered one by one, like signals. At home, I poured a drink I hadn't planned on having and sat in the dark. For the first time in years, I wasn't anticipating tomorrow's crisis. I was watching one unfold from the outside. There's a difference. Late that night, an email arrived. Subject,
Proposed terms discussion. No demands, no posture, just an invitation. I opened it slowly. They were ready to listen now. But listening doesn't erase what was revealed under pressure. The silence, the compliance, the way no one stood up when it mattered. Those things don't vanish with a contract revision. As I typed my response, I realized something that surprised even me. This wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. I wasn't trying to hurt Northbridge. I was trying to make sure I never stood in that lobby again, waiting for someone else to decide my worth. I hit send. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, and somewhere across the city, Ethan Collins was starting to understand that power borrowed without wisdom doesn't just fade, it collapses. Slowly, then all at once.
The morning after, the tension in the air was almost tangible, even from a distance. I didn't have to be inside Northbridge to sense the change. Calls came relentlessly, emails piled up, and the stock ticker refused to climb. Every glance at the news made my pulse quicken, not out of fear, but from the realization that my absence was creating ripples far bigger than I had imagined. Sometimes, stepping aside is the most powerful move you can make. Have you ever felt the weight of quiet influence? I sat in my study, reviewing the email exchanges and internal memos I'd intercepted through a trusted contact. Northbridge's executives were scrambling, trying to undo the chaos that one impulsive decision had caused. Ethan's name kept popping up in the internal chatter, panic disguised as confidence. He was still walking the halls, trying to appear in control, but those who had been watching the room carefully, the legal team, senior partners, already saw through the facade. It's interesting how quickly arrogance crumbles when structure is challenged. Ethan had assumed authority was enough, but authority without understanding, without experience, was nothing but a brittle mask. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the look on his face the day he fired me, the public humiliation, the smug satisfaction in front of everyone. That erased any sympathy. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed again. Board members, not asking politely this time. They were desperate. Their words were careful, yet urgent. I read each message slowly, savoring the moment when those who thought power came from titles alone finally realized it came from results, from earned authority. The irony was delicious, but I didn't indulge. Patience was part of the plan. Around noon, I finally returned a call. The board chair's voice was strained. "Daniel, we've reviewed your terms. We understand the implications of the key person clause. The deal cannot proceed without you." I leaned back in my chair, eyes narrowing. "Good," I said evenly. "Then let's be very clear. If I return, I'm not coming back as the same employee you fired. This is about stability, not convenience. My role will be defined by authority earned, not inherited titles." There was a long pause. He swallowed, then nodded audibly. "Understood. We'll prepare the agreement." It was happening. The first steps of leverage turning into control. But this wasn't the climax yet, not by a long shot. I knew the full measure of my influence would only be realized when the deal closed under my direction, on my terms. Until then, every interaction, every hesitation from the board, every misstep by Ethan was part of the slow unraveling. I watched the market closely. Northbridge's stock still wavered, pressured by uncertainty. Investors were growing impatient. Analysts were asking questions in public forums, and I stayed calm, observing, calculating. Sometimes the most devastating moves happen without a single dramatic confrontation. Subtlety is the most effective form of power. Late afternoon, I received a brief message from Ethan. 3 words: "We need to talk." I smiled. Not outwardly, not visibly, just a small private satisfaction. He still didn't understand that talking wasn't what mattered. Results mattered. And he had already demonstrated he couldn't manage the very thing he thought he controlled. By evening, I drafted my final response to the board. Clear, precise, with no room for misinterpretation.
Conditions, authority, responsibility, all spelled out. The terms would ensure that no single impulsive decision could undermine the company again, and, more importantly, that my expertise and years of loyalty would be recognized, not dismissed. As I hit send, I leaned back and let the tension release slowly. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the darkening sky. Somewhere inside Northbridge, Ethan was learning that arrogance without judgment is fleeting. Power, when unearned, is fragile, and sometimes the consequences arrive in quiet waves before crashing down all at once. I poured a drink and raised it slightly, to no one but myself. For the first time in years, I felt in control, not just of a deal, but of my destiny. And I knew the final confrontation was coming. Not loud, not messy, but inevitable. Ethan Collins had no idea just how costly his arrogance would become, and when the moment arrived, he wouldn't be able to hide behind a title or a family name. The game had changed, and I was holding all the pieces. By tomorrow, the $2.9 billion deal wouldn't just be saved, it would be completed on my terms. And Ethan Collins would finally understand that power taken without wisdom is the most expensive mistake of all.
The morning light felt different that day, sharper somehow, as if the world itself was aware that something had shifted. I arrived at Northbridge not as the man they had fired, not as the one they had humiliated, but as the one now holding the leverage they had ignored. Every step down the polished marble hall reminded me of 18 years of work, of late nights, of deals that had only succeeded because I cared more than anyone else. And now I was about to prove that experience cannot be dismissed. The board was already assembled, the room tense with a mixture of relief and fear. Faces that had been indifferent, even cold weeks ago, were now lined with apprehension. Ethan Collins stood at the edge, trying to appear composed, but I could see it in his posture, the uncertainty creeping into a man who had never faced the consequences of his impulsiveness before. I didn't rush to speak. I let the silence stretch, long enough for them to feel the weight of what had happened, for them to remember that it was my absence that nearly cost them billions. The legal advisors shuffled papers nervously. The CFO glanced at me, eyes wide. It wasn't arrogance, it was acknowledgement. "I've reviewed the terms," I began, voice calm but deliberate. "If this deal is to move forward, it will be under conditions that reflect reality, not entitlement. My role, my authority, and the responsibility I carry cannot be overridden by impulsive decisions." The room exhaled slowly, a collective recognition that the game had changed. Ethan's jaw tightened, his face a mask, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled slightly. Every minute he tried to project confidence, I could see the cracks forming, small but undeniable. The signing began, each signature deliberate, each clause reviewed carefully. I guided the process, not aggressively, not vengefully, but with the precision that only comes from someone who has lived and breathed the stakes for nearly 2 decades. Investors watched closely, lawyers nodded in approval, and the press release was quietly delayed, not out of fear, but because there was now a new order in place, one grounded in competence, not nepotism. By the time the final signatures were made, the $2.9 billion deal had been secured, not because of titles or family names, but because of earned authority. I stood back as the board acknowledged the completion, Ethan standing nearby, silent, no longer commanding the room, but observing. That was the real lesson. Power without judgment is meaningless. Walking out of the conference room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. The freedom to build without permission, to influence without fear, to act without waiting for validation. My phone buzzed once more, a single message from a trusted colleague. "It's done." I smiled.
This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It wasn't about humiliating Ethan publicly or reveling in the panic of others. It was about reclaiming what was always mine: respect, recognition, and the understanding that true authority comes from skill and integrity, not inherited positions. Days later, when I sat down to reflect, I realized that getting fired hadn't been the end of my career. It had been the catalyst. I had stopped playing small. I had refused to allow someone else's arrogance to define my value. And in doing so, I had built something that no impulsive decision, no family name, and no boardroom error could ever take away. Ethan Collins would remember this lesson for the rest of his life, as do all those who confuse power with wisdom. True power, I had learned, is earned in silence, proven in action, and cemented through consequence. And for me, the lesson was clear. Loyalty and patience have their price, but when they are finally recognized, the reward is far greater than any single deal could ever be.